Thank you for joining this video walkthrough of Underlayered Suspicion. In this video, we will examine the report's analysis of Canada's whole of government strategy to combat radicalization and the use of tax audits as a mechanism to implement Canada's whole of government policies, particularly as we've identified them relative to their institutional bias. This particular video assumes that you've listened to the video on anti-terrorism financing and will include reference to that herein. Now, Canada's whole of government approach to anti-radicalization, as we write about in the report, stems from its 2018 national strategy. Its radicalization policy is designed, of course, to pursue the future possible acts of terrorism and stem it before it ever takes place. So whereas anti-terrorism financing, the other whole of government policy, oftentimes operates after the fact in this punishment mode, in this criminal action mode, anti-radicalization is a pursuit mode in that it tries to, using non-criminal modes of prosecution, to try to nonetheless stem the possible future crimes that might occur in the course of radicalization. And so there's a way in which anti-radicalization policies are really designed around prediction models. And that's part of the problem is, what is a model by which you predict future crime? Can we do that effectively? What are the risks that attend to that? And of course, one big risk that attends to any forms of pursuit policies like anti-radicalization is various forms of profiling. Now, what's important is that in 2018, public safety, the Ministry of Public Safety issued a national strategy on countering radicalization to violence. And as policymakers explained therein, radicalization to violence occurs when a person or group takes on extreme ideas and begins to think they should use violence to support or advance their ideas or belief. Now, what's important for us to think about is this notion of extreme ideas. When does an idea that might come from somewhere on the political spectrum, left to right, when does it take on the aura of being extreme and therefore subject to national security metrics? Because remember, we are now in the realm of ideas, policing ideas that might, when taken to their logical extreme, translate into action. And it's before those ideas turn into action that we want to stem them. How do you do that? How do you do that without running afoul of core values like freedom of expression, freedom of belief, things like that? This is key to this issue. Now, what's important is the Ministry of Public Safety, in its document, takes on the initiative to ensure that it's not overtly discriminatory. It makes efforts to indicate that there's no one group subject to this form of extremism. And so it tries to be rather ecumenical in its approach to who might be an extremist, what might be extreme ideas, and who might otherwise take on the role of the radical. The problem, however, is once you can certainly create a policy at a very high level, and certainly in this case, a high level of abstraction. The real issue is the real proof is in the pudding that's funnily made, as one might say. And this is where we begin to see that we can't really address the systemic nature, the systemic biases embedded within the national strategy until we look at how it's applied. And here, this is where the compliance with the Income Tax Act is actually quite significant. Now, whether the charities in this report were pursued because of possible connections to terrorist financing or pursued because of possible connections to radicalization, in all cases of the three charities reviewed, each one of them violated Income Tax Act requirements. There's no doubt about it. They were not compliant. Now, the CRA and the Charities Directorate has the authority to deregister any charity that's not compliant with Income Tax Act record keeping. And on the one hand, on the face of it, that seems pretty straightforward. Sure, why not? Why wouldn't we want charities to be good record keepers? Why wouldn't we want them to be able to report clearly where their activities have been going, how they've been managed, and so on? They benefit with the charitable status by precluding the government from taxing them. Shouldn't they then also be accountable? Completely understandable. The problem that we have with the operation of the Income Tax Act in these cases is that they always come in the shadow of suspicious notions of radicalization or suspicious notions of of terrorist financing. And the evidence used on the terrorist financing front or the radicalization front is suspect in and of itself. The research is flawed, as the case study video walkthroughs will show. So when you combine these highly suspect and potentially discriminatory whole of government policies as shadowing the Income Tax Act analysis, it actually taints the Income Tax Act analysis entirely. So while the CRA will say, for instance, in the Ottawa Islamic Center case, that technically the Ottawa Islamic Center was deregistered because of violations of the Income Tax Act, not for radicalization. They do admit in one of our ATIP requests that we identify in the case study as well, that they were initially investigated for violating what is another test, the public benefit test, because of possibilities of radicalization. It was there, it hovers in the air. But when you have whole of government policies like anti-terrorism financing and like the counter-radicalization that are the harbingers of systemic discrimination potentially, are embedded with the potential biases that might focus on one group to the exclusion of all others, is the Income Tax Act compliance mechanism really just pretext for what is otherwise a policy by another name? And that's the problem with the violations of the Income Tax Act. We recognize that charities are vulnerable to this. Charities, but if you look at any charity in any tradition, the scholarship suggests that they will all violate some aspect of the Tax Act. The Tax Act is ambiguous. The Tax Act isn't always clear. The scope of information and record keeping will vary. And so it's not like the Tax Act is always the clearest thing, even for accountants or lawyers. So the point then is, can we rely simply on the fact that these organizations violated the Tax Act to calm our fears and anxieties around the Charities Directorate's approach? And what we argue is no, we can't. We can't use this as the final say, because this particular approach, the use of Tax Act compliance, occurs in the context of these other policies that we think are suspect. And that explains for this video, along with the other one on anti-terrorism financing, gives you a sense of the theoretical framework that we bring to each of the case studies, which will be featured in the next videos.